Okay, so it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this session, which is entitled Buddhism, Behaviorism, and the Brain, toward a better understanding of the nature, mechanisms, and mitigation of craving, grasping, and addiction. And I'm really going to make this brief. We've got two wonderful presenters for you today. Dr. Judd Brewer, who's at the University of Massachusetts at Worcester, and Dr. Sarah Bowen, who's at Pacific University, and they're basically going to take it away. So join me in welcoming them.
Thanks, Amishi, and it's great to be here. I'm going to jump right in because we want to make sure that we have plenty of time at the end for you all to ask questions. So I'm going to talk first about some of the psychological and neurobiological mechanisms, and then Sarah's going to take it away and give some more of the nitty-gritty and how this actually works in practice, as well as talk about some of the clinical trials that have been done in this field. What I'll start with pointing out is that there's a lot that's known about the associative learning process, and this is the process that is most fundamental for addictive learning behaviors. I'm using an example here with smoking and eating, but you can imagine that this extrapolates to a lot of other addictive behaviors as well. And the basic premise is that through positive affect, reward becomes reinforced. So something happens that's good. In this example, you eat a good meal, it feels good. You have a craving to eat some more of that good food. You eat more, it feels good, and that good feeling continues. You lay down a memory, and then this feeds back in a positive reinforcement way. And this also increases salience of cues that are similar. So if there are other foods that look good, you're going to be more likely to eat those. The same happens with negative reinforcement as well. If you get yelled at by your boss, it doesn't feel so good. Your brain says, hey, why don't you go eat something or take a break, because that helps you feel better. That makes the negative go away. You lay down that memory. Next time you get yelled at by your boss, you should eat something or you should go out for a smoke. And again, this reinforces the negative reinforcement pathways and again increases the salience for negative cues. Okay? Relatively straightforward. This has been known all the way back to Thorndike, who first published on this back in the late 1800s. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize for this in the early 2000s for his work in the sea slug, because this is such a conserved process. Now, it's interesting when you look at some of the current behavioral treatments for addictions. For example, in AA, there's this saying, avoid people, places, and things. So you can imagine, and fitting with this mechanistic pathway, that if you avoid cues, then those cues don't feed into the positive and negative reinforcement loops. That makes a lot of sense. Another strategy that's been used is substitute behavior. So if you're smoking, you might go and eat candy instead or eat carrot sticks. And this also provides a behavior that's not smoking, that doesn't reinforce the smoking pattern. But as you can see, this loop stays intact. It doesn't get dismantled when you substitute a behavior. So for example, if you run out of carrot sticks, your brain says, hey, where are my carrot sticks? And you say, sorry, I didn't get them at the grocery store. And it says, well, I'm going back to smoking. And of course, substituting one food for another, you can try to substitute healthy food for unhealthy food, but food in itself is difficult to substitute for itself. And as some of you might know, it's really hard to work with sugary substances. They turn out in animal studies to be more addictive than crack cocaine. Now, how does this actually line up with the early Buddhist models of reinforcement learning? It turns out that in a process called dependent origination, and actually, a show of hands, how many folks have heard of this term? All right, I'm in the right place. So dependent origination, in a nutshell, is it's a linked process of 12 steps. And it's more of an amalgam, but if you want to think about it linearly, you can think of a cue that comes into the mind that gets interpreted. And the mind interprets cues both environmentally, so the five senses, but it also interprets thinking or thoughts as well. And these get interpreted as pleasant or unpleasant. And this leads to craving. So again, craving for the pleasant to continue and craving for the unpleasant to go away, which then leads to the behavior. In the terminology back in the day, they described this as the birth of a self-identity and a sense of me, which again, without memory, we wouldn't have a sense of self. So you can think of that memory as me, and this reinforces the habit. And of course, this reinforcement process is described as ignorance. So you can think of these glasses as we start to get a distorted view of how the world should work and how we can live in a happy way in the world. And of course, the term for this is samsara. It's endless wandering, because this loop, as it gets reinforced, just reinforces itself but doesn't actually fix the core processes. So if you're stressed out and you're eating chocolate because you're stressed out, that chocolate's not going to actually fix the root cause of your stress. Again, this was described in the Dhammapada, the early Pali Canon, just as a tree, though cut down, can grow again and again if its roots are strong and undamaged. In the same way, if the roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. I like this modern-day interpretation. And it's interesting, in the song, he actually talks about smoking. So where might mindfulness come in these psychological mechanisms? And instead of helping people avoid cues or create substitute behaviors, it's described, and some describe this literally, this wedge of mindfulness, which can come in and help people work with craving such that they don't move to automatically act on it. And in essence, this breaks this addictive loop rather than treating around it. So is this actually true? And mindfulness is about paying attention. Is paying attention actually going to help somebody change a behavior as addictive as smoking? So the idea is, pay attention, everything else will take care of itself. Now, when we've done clinical trials with smoking in particular, the first thing that we teach people is to pay attention when they smoke. Now, the reason for this is that they actually start to see what they get from smoking. And here's an example of somebody in our program. She said, "Mindful smoking smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck." Now, this is really, really important, because people will our brains will do all sorts of things to convince us that what we're doing is a good idea. But when we really rub our face in it, when we really see what we're getting from what we're doing, suddenly we can't pretend that we didn't see that. And that's what this person described. And in the sutras, it's really described as this process of disenchantment. When we see clearly, when we explore gratification to its end, knowledge and vision arises. And this is the beginning of the end as described here. So does this actually lead to tangible outcomes? Sarah's going to go into these more, but I'll just show an example from a smoking study that we did, where we randomized people to get mindfulness training or the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking. I won't go into all the details because it's published, but the long and short of it is that with biochemically verified abstinence, we get twice the quit rates with 4 weeks of mindfulness training compared to gold standard treatment. And these effects last over time. We only looked 4 months later, but these were largely maintained in the mindfulness training group, where they had lost ground in the Freedom from Smoking group. So this was interesting, twice as good as gold standard treatment. What's actually going on here? Our hypothesis was that mindfulness would work by decoupling craving and behavior. So we predicted that we would see the dissociation between craving and smoking before they both subsided. The idea is, if craving is this fire that's burning really strong, if you stop adding fuel to that fire, it doesn't suddenly go out, but it burns down over time. So mathematically, we found that there's, again, a strong association between craving and smoking at the beginning of treatment that's completely gone at the end of mindfulness training. And for those of you aficionados, if you look at moderation equations, baseline craving, cigarette use, and end of treatment craving don't actually predict the likelihood that somebody's going to quit. It's about practice. So when you bring informal practice into the equation, it completely moderates the dissociation between craving and smoking. Now, this is a lot of math, and you can do a lot of things with statistics, so I like to look at raw data. And if you look at the raw data, at the end of treatment, you can see that the craving is the same level for the people that quit and the people that don't quit. The abstainers are here in red. And you see that the folks that quit, their craving burns down over time. And we start to see a dissociation months later once that residual fuel for the fire is consumed. So back to our model, it does seem that that mindfulness might create this wedge that actually helps to break this loop. At least that's what our modeling suggests. And again, back to the early Buddhist teachings, they talk about, once this craving is destroyed, it conquers all suffering. So I'll just talk about our next steps here. We're now looking to see how we can disseminate this in a form that is standardized, that maintains fidelity, and also can get at people's fingertips, because cue-based learning and context-based learning is really critical for both forming and as well as breaking behaviors. So we created a smartphone app where we can actually package the training in 21 days of 21 modules where they get daily sessions. We can give them animations to drive the key points home. And we can even do in vivo exercises so they can actually smoke where they typically smoke while paying attention. They can't do that in our smoke-free clinic. And importantly, we can collect experience sampling data so we can test efficacy. I'll just give an example of the informal practice, the one that was shown to be that moderated the effect, the breaking of the link between craving and smoking. The idea here is that using this RAIN acronym where people can recognize that the craving is there, allow it to be there instead of resisting it, really allow it to be there, and get curious. What does it feel like? What's it feel like in my body right now? And the typical N here is non-identification. Might be a little tough to train that early on in practice, so we moved to the Mahasi-style noting, where people can note their sensations. Is it tightness? Is it tension? Is it burning? Which also helps give them a little bit of perspective instead of being sucked into the sensations. They can see, oh, this is just a sensation as compared to me. And we can also put this front and center for folks. We call this the wantometer, so whenever they have a craving and they want a cigarette, they can tap on there. It can walk them through the training. So the next steps for this are we have several randomized trials that have just been funded so we can actually test the efficacy of this and even adapt it for teenagers. Now, just in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the neurobiological mechanisms. I'm going to start with a story. So I don't know how many of you remember Lolo Jones. She was a hurdler who was favored to win the Olympic gold medal in the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And she was actually in the lead in the finals at the 9th of 10 hurdles. And then what happened? In an interview with Time magazine, she said, I was just in an amazing rhythm. And then I knew at one point I was winning the race. It wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out. So I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. So instead of letting herself do what she had trained to do, she tripped herself up, literally. And the important piece here is it wasn't that she was thinking, it was that she got caught up in her thinking. So how common do we think, how common is this, where we're not in the present moment? How often do we get in our own way? So if it's any indication, there was a study at Harvard that probably many of you are familiar with that was done 4 years ago now, Matt Killingsworth, where they found that 50% of time when they pinged people throughout the day, that 50% of their time, they weren't paying attention to what was going on. So we're regretting what we did in the past, we're worrying about the future, and we're not in the present. So you can imagine that there's a spectrum here from daydreaming to where we get stressed out, we get caught up in stuff, to addiction. Now, because this is so prevalent, you can actually measure this neurobiologically. And this was dubbed the default mode network 10 years back in 2000, a long time ago before people figured out what was going on. And it's aptly named because this is what we actually default to. There have been a lot of studies with this. Now I'm just going to highlight one by Sue Whitfield Gabrielli because she actually brought the idea of what's actually going on. So the instruction for most resting state fMRI is to lay still and don't do anything in particular. And when people lay still and don't do anything in particular, it turns out, as this study showed, that people do a lot of self-referential processing. So she had people do that baseline task, and she also had them do a self-referencing task. And she found, as you can see in these two blobs in green, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, the two main hubs of the default mode network, both are convergently activated. They're activated when we're not doing anything in particular and when we're particularly doing self-referencing tasks, suggesting that most of the time when we're not doing anything in particular, we're doing something related to ourselves. Now, just to zone in on the posterior cingulate, this is a curious brain region because it's been shown to be activated by a number of different things. So as I mentioned, mind wandering, thinking about ourselves. This also gets activated when there's self-attribution in social situations, when we have induced immoral behavior, basically when you have people lie in the scanner and you measure their brain activity. It gets activated during guilt, during emotional processing, and most importantly for this talk, it gets activated during craving. I'll just give an example of this. Hugh Garavan's group showed that when you show cues to cocaine addicts, that the posterior cingulate cortex, among a few others, gets activated. And there was an interesting point that they put in this paper where they said that this activation in the PC may reflect the participation of a normal endogenous drive state or craving response, since this region was also shown to be active with thirst in normal subjects. And we're going to come back to this in a second, thirst. So how does all of this fit with meditation? Our group and other groups have actually found that across a number of different meditations, that these same regions of the default mode network get deactivated during meditation. So during concentration practice, breath awareness, loving kindness, choiceless awareness, all of these practices deactivate the default mode network, and in particular the posterior cingulate cortex. Veronique Taylor did similar studies where experienced meditators viewing IAPS pictures, these emotionally laden pictures, also are less, they activate their posterior cingulate less, and Giuseppe Pagnoni actually linked this to behavioral outcomes. So how do all of these studies actually converge? Now, our working hypothesis is that that people are actually getting caught up in experience, and when this caught upness happens, the posterior cingulate, as a marker of probably a larger network of brain regions, gets activated, and when we get out of our own way, when we let go, then this region gets deactivated. And we've done some real-time neurofeedback studies that I don't have time to go into that have detailed this a little bit more. So just to finish up and bring this back to our model, it's really interesting if you look at the operant conditioning, it seems that this getting caught up in craving seems to be where we might see a convergence both with the psychological models and the neurobiology. Now, bringing this back to thirst, the literal Pali word for craving is tanha, which is literally translated as thirst. And thirst leads, or craving leads to the next step in dependent origination, which is attachment, or getting caught up in, or getting attached to experience. So we can see how all of these might actually converge, such that we can, from a very mechanistic standpoint, start tackling how we would help people work with cravings and their addictions. So I'm going to stop there. Lots of folks contributed to this work, and I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. And I always enjoy conversations with Judd because he's one of the few colleagues who I think gets as excited about this alignment between behavioral principles and conditioning models and Buddhism and mindfulness practice, and the potential for deepening our understanding and increasing the efficacy of our treatments from this perspective. So, it's working up there. Okay, there we go. So I wanted to reflect a little on the model that Judd proposed. I'm coming primarily from a relapse prevention background. So my work has been in looking at how we can help people in early stages of abstinence to maintain their treatment goals and reduce the likelihood and severity of relapse. So looking at this model in terms of relapse, as Judd explained, this typically begins with a cue. So if someone is fresh out of treatment, let's say, and they are walking down the street and they walk by their favorite bar, there's a cue, coupled with oftentimes a state of mind or a physical state. In the early stages of substance use, oftentimes this is what we call a positive expectancy. So I see a bar and I think about, oh, it'd be really fun to go in there and have a drink. I'm done with work, I want to relax, my friends are in there. And then this is often followed by a behavior, not surprisingly. And then, as I said in the beginning, oftentimes this can be a pleasurable experience. I go in there, I have fun with my friends, it turns out the way I wanted it to, and we have here an example of positive reinforcement, where this then feeds, again, my desire the next time I encounter this cue. However, what happens oftentimes as substance use progresses, or any addictive behavior progresses into the cycles of addiction, is that this cue often is coupled with discomfort. So I'm fighting against this craving. I don't want to use, but I'm feeling really anxious today, and I know this is going to help me. So I'm going to go towards it to relieve my anxiety. So this pleasure then actually becomes a relief, an avoidance of something that was aversive to me. And when we look at the studies on relapse prevention, people cite these more kind of internal aversive states as the reason that they begin using. So the number one reason that people state is negative affect. I'm feeling something I don't want to feel. This is going to make it better. However, of course, in the long run, this negative reinforcement model is really strengthened by what's called in the relapse prevention literature the abstinence violation effect. So I've been abstinent for a while, I engage in substance use, I feel better for a moment, I feel some relief of that anxiety, but then of course, all these other things start to happen. I feel shame, I feel guilt, I have lots of thoughts about being a failure, et cetera, that adds to the discomfort, and you can see how this cycle becomes pretty intractable. And oftentimes, people with addictions will explain this as feeling very automatic. And I think what they're tapping into here is this very sort of automated process of conditioning when this happens. It's sort of a system that's running itself. So looking at ways that these practices and approaches can help people step out of that automatic cycle of behavior. And as Judd was talking about, this very important, just crucial foundation of awareness. So awareness of how this whole process works and learning how to observe it in ourselves. And right there, we've already kind of stepped out of an automatic mode. We can see maybe more clearly what's happening. And then what I want to also point to today is this shifting, very explicitly shifting the relationship from avoidance to a more kind of curious approach-based relationship to discomfort. How can we learn to be with discomfort differently so that it doesn't have control over our behavior? And then some targeted skills and practices to do these things, to raise awareness, to be with discomfort differently. So I want to focus on that middle piece, that exposure piece, being with discomfort differently. Typically, we see exposure response prevention in the literature, oftentimes around phobias or anxiety. For purposes of this model, I think I want to call it response flexibility. So increasing our range of choices in how we might respond to a certain behavior. So exposure is typically used, exposure models, when we're trying to change our reaction to a stimuli that's typically avoided. So in phobias and anxiety disorders, oftentimes this is an external stimulus. It might be a spider or heights or an elevator or some such thing. What we're talking about here is more typically internal. So maybe a rumination cycle that's really aversive to me, or maybe a certain emotion that I don't like, or a physical state like withdrawal that I would rather avoid. So what are we doing when we're sitting in our practice? Is we're directly combating this kind of impulse by sitting with whatever arises. So it's this kind of exposure. These things come up, we're exposed to them. So rather than avoiding them, we're actually inviting them in, sitting right in the middle of them, if you will. And also having this sense of acceptance. So rather than avoidance, more of a curiosity and acceptance. And this, as you can see, is really kind of overriding that previous conditioning. So another way that I like to think of this and share with clients is oftentimes the subjective experience of a craving or an urge is like this, right? Over time, there's intensity, and it goes up and up and up and up and up, and something horrible is going to happen unless I put a stop to it. And so I've got to react. That's oftentimes a very real experience. However, in reality, what happens is that just strengthens that behavior and that intensity. And if we stay with it over time, what actually happens is it goes up and up, it peaks, and then at some point it needs to subside. So if we can learn to stay with this, what we know from exposure literature is that the strength of that intensity tends to, over time, go down. Additionally, with these mindfulness practices, we're learning that even when those are intense, we can increase our capacity to hold them. So just briefly, some ways that we work with these principles clinically in the substance abuse population. There's a practice we use called the sober space. It's very similar to what Judd talked about, the RAIN practice. And it's an acronym which is very familiar to a lot of people in substance abuse treatment, sort of from the AA model. So we use the acronym SOBER, S for stopping, right there, stopping and stepping out of that conditioned automatic pilot cycle, bringing awareness, observing what's avoiding it to actually approaching it and examining it. And then gathering attention and just focusing on the breath as a way to put our attention, have a choice where our attention is going. expanding attention again as a way to increase the capacity to hold whatever's happening and also the flexibility. And then finally, leading to a response. So this is a chosen action versus this sort of reactive behavior. Another practice that really gets at the exposure principle very directly is called urge surfing. It's from the relapse prevention literature of Marlatt and Gordon. And this is a practice where we ask clients to actually call to mind an experience that elicits some craving or an urge. And we walk them through a practice where they feel this growing in intensity, and they stay with it as best they can. And they're instructed to ride it, using their breath, using their body sensations as a way to stay grounded and steady, and to trust that it will change. And they see that if they stay with this, it naturally over time subsides. So looking at how treatment in many of these mindfulness-based programs works in terms of working with addiction is in the beginning, we're really training this basic awareness, beginning with very tangible objects such as a raisin, moving to awareness of more internal kinds of experiences, and then to the more kind of ephemeral experiences of thoughts and sensations and emotions, things that are a little bit more subtle after they've been training their attention for a period of time. And then moving into how to use those techniques like we just saw in the sober space to pause in the midst of a very difficult reactive situation. And finally moving towards making that choice that's going to best serve them rather than reacting and avoiding, and ultimately leading to freedom that comes from this awareness and this ability to have some flexibility. So there have been really exciting trends in the substance abuse and mindfulness literature recently, and I don't have time to kind of go through all the studies that have happened, but just as sort of an index of that here, we can see that there are 176 peer-reviewed publications, 20 clinical trials, and this was a while ago. There may be more actually at this point, and we've had 3 now special issues in substance abuse journals dedicated specifically to mindfulness-based treatments. And that's just in the last 5 years, so it's certainly growing. What I want to focus on specifically, rather than the main outcomes of these studies, which are very exciting, is a way that these studies seem to be trending towards looking at data and looking at these processes a little different. So initially, as in, I'm guessing, most psychological literatures, you're trying to look at symptoms and get them to reduce. So there's been a lot of studies that are looking at symptoms and getting them to reduce. But what's happening also more recently is people are beginning to look at the relationships between the symptoms. So rather than just trying to get craving to go down or substance use to go down, looking at how people are responding to craving, and can we get some movement there? So in this model here, we're interested kind of in these relationships between these different variables, between discomfort and craving, and then between craving and reaction. So one study that's a beautiful example of this is actually looking at food and healthy and unhealthy eating behaviors by Esther Pappies and her colleagues. And she looked at a sample of undergraduate students and was interested in how coming with a vulnerability, they were hungry when they came into the study, and they were exposed to food cues, and how might a brief mindfulness intervention affect their experience and their behavior. So she looked at how this affected their craving or how attractive the food was, and then what food choices did they make specifically healthy versus unhealthy. And what she found here was that there was sort of a disentangling or an attenuation of this relationship between seeing the food and experiencing craving. So again, we're seeing this nice looking at this relationship and how mindfulness can affect that path. Another study that we did in our lab, we were interested in looking at the relationship between negative affect, specifically depression, and craving and substance use. So we did find that there was a mediating relationship here, but we specifically were interested in what paths were being affected by the mindfulness training, and found that, again, similar to Esther's study, this relationship between the cue and the craving was being decoupled, and that in turn was affecting the substance use. Another study that Judd and his colleagues did that we heard about was looking at smokers exposed to cues in the natural environment, again with the vulnerability of smoking history, so they've got the conditioning on board, and looking at how mindfulness interventions, mindfulness training affected their craving and then affected their smoking. And as we heard, found here that there's this decoupling of that conditioned reaction to craving, leading directly to smoking. And a couple more examples of this. Another smoking study that we did a while ago in our lab, looking at college students who were smokers who were abstaining from smoking, so they had some craving on board already. We exposed them to some cues and looked at their craving and their smoking at a follow-up time, and found here, interestingly, this link further down in the chain that they were still experiencing the craving in relation to the cues, but their reaction to the craving was changing. So that second link there was being loosened. And then finally, one final example, Eric Garland and his colleagues looking at a population of adults with chronic opiate use and looking at them at follow-up in their natural environments, natural cues in the environment, looking at levels of craving and opioid use, and found here similarly this loosening of this association between craving and opioid use. So some really lovely examples here, I think, of what we've seen in the conditioning models of how these mindfulness-based practices and approaches can help override that conditioning. And then I just briefly, to end, wanted to share, kind of step out of the graphs and numbers and share some really nice statements from some of the clients and how they're describing this process changing in their own lives. So the first was from a woman who was in one of our private practice groups who had been struggling for a while with alcohol use and relapse. I paused and watched my breath. The urges and thoughts would keep poking their heads up, but they got quieter and just weren't as big of a deal. I sat until I didn't feel like I had to act on these thoughts and feelings. Finally, I saw the situation clearly. I could make a different choice. So you really see here that these urges are still coming up, and the physiology and the thoughts and the emotion, and she's learning to distance a little bit and respond differently. Some clients are working with in incarcerated settings. One gentleman described, I'm now able to regularly surf these kinds of triggering situations, not just with drinking, but with other discomfort or unpleasant states. He'd been working a bit with aggression issues. And then finally, one of the youth we were working with. Before I got to the group, I'd react to my emotions just because I had them, because I felt them. But after we did urge surfing and stuff like that, I noticed I can actually feel what I'm feeling, but not react to what's going on. Very eloquently stated by this youth, I think. So thank you very much for your attention. We wanted to leave plenty of time for questions you might have. I don't think they're live.
Yeah, we're good.
Oh, yeah, they are.
So they're probably going to suggest that you come up to the mic to ask a question. So step on up.
Hi. I'm curious, you guys talked a lot about awareness practices, but I'm wondering with regard to self-compassion and loving-kindness practice, if you've done work on that, because I know in battling my brownie addiction when I was anxious, it really, really helped me to recognize that I was anxious and do some compassion practices, and that was incredibly effective as a complement to the awareness practices.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. We actually in the beginning sort of shied away from that a little bit because I don't know why. I think we were afraid that how it would be received, and then saw very quickly in working with the addictions population how needed it was in that abstinence violation effect with all the shame and the stigma and the self-hatred, and began bringing it in much more explicitly then, as well as forgiveness practices. And found that, and we don't have data on those specifically, kind of the component analysis kind of thing, but found that those practices were received very well. Difficult, but appreciated.
Yeah. And I'll just add, we start with body scan, and then in about week 2 or 2.5, we introduced loving kindness. so that there's a little bit of a foundation. And we've, just like Sarah's talking about, people are reporting that that's tremendously helpful. And people, I had one patient I'm thinking of who said, we asked, what was the best thing about this treatment? He was a mechanic, and he had come in with his greasy hands, and he said, loving kindness, very sheepishly, and he said, it really changed my relationship with my dad. And he was somebody who was coming in for alcohol dependence. So that piece is really helpful. And we're now working with people who have eating, like binge eating issues and kind of that addictive loop. And maybe not surprisingly, that's one of the main practices that they say is very, very, very helpful for them, because they fall off the wagon all the time because you have to eat. And so they're saying the loving kindness is tremendously helpful. So we certainly teach it, and I think that it's extremely valuable.
So thank you both for a really, really great talk and very thought-provoking. So one of the things that in looking, Judd, particularly at your model, but both of your models, is I liked where, the sort of craving, there was craving, and then the mindfulness kind of came right at the throat, and so one of the things that made me wonder about is, at least in substance use treatment, there's the idea of harm reduction. And it seems like with the models that you have, it's either you're quote unquote on or off the wagon. And I'm wondering about is there a way to, like with people who are cutting down on alcohol or tobacco, does harm reduction play a role? And if so, how do you navigate that?
Yeah. I would absolutely say that harm reduction is part of this. So for folks that are not ready to quit, and there are a lot of folks that even come into treatment and they think they're ready to quit, and then when they actually are faced with it, they're not. And so the harm reduction piece, I think it's really inherent in helping people see clearly what they're getting, because when they start to see what they're getting, they start to reduce the amount. They might not go completely abstinent, and you can't go completely abstinent from eating, for example. So it gets even trickier when you're trying to change addictive behaviors around things that we're physiologically dependent upon. So I see it very much as the harm reduction is the first step, and then when people are ready, they quit, if it's smoking, for example. But that it's very much inherent in the model of just seeing clearly what you get from your behavior. And when you see really clearly, like for some people it takes a long time, and there's something that's still there, like, oh yeah, it's kind of good, and then eventually they say, what am I doing? And that's where they quit. But you really have to meet them where they're at, and I think that fits very nicely with what we're seeing and also what we're seeing clinically. I don't know, maybe you can add to that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we're looking more at the function of the behavior rather than sort of the topography of it. So it depends how that substance is functioning in someone's life. So whether or not they're ready, or even if they decide to continue use but in a different way, these models, I think, are really looking at how is this serving you in your life? Are you turning to this as a refuge that's actually not serving you? And if so, do you want to make some changes there? So whether or not they continue to use or not, I don't think is as important as them seeing for themselves what the function is and learning how to take better care of themselves.
Good question.
Thank you both for a very fascinating presentation. I was curious whether, either in your own experiences or in the literature itself, if there's any information as to patient characteristics which may indicate better response rates or a poorer response rate. As a clinician, I'm just curious as selecting treatment modalities for my different patients and who might be ideal or not ideal candidates. Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, great question. I think it's exciting. I think that we're just starting to kind of turn to those kinds of questions. One thing that we found, and I honestly don't remember if this is published yet or not, but one thing we found in our groups is that folks, we were looking at 12-step versus a cognitive behavioral relapse prevention versus a mindfulness-based relapse prevention, and we actually found that the folks who had been through the relapse cycle tended to be older and had had more of a history of relapse, similar to the MBCT findings, were actually the ones who were benefiting the most from the mindfulness group. And it anecdotally, it seems to me those people have been through every other treatment. It's not working. They're on their knees. They're ready to change their life in a very radical way, to change their mind in a radical way. And they're responding. They're ready for this. The folks who did better in the more structured groups were the younger folks, first-time offenders, maybe a DUI, who were coming in more with the attitude of like, there's nothing wrong. I'm mandated. I have to be here. I don't really need to change. They tended to do better in the more kind of rule-governed, I think, treatments.
You mentioned the rumination cycle. Can you talk a little bit about the rumination cycle as an addictive process and about mindfulness applications to breaking that cycle?
Me?
Both. Great question. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I think Zindel Siegel's work obviously addresses that much more beautifully and eloquently than maybe I can, but the way that I view it and see it functioning is it's another behavior. Whether the behavior is internal in those cycles or external in those cycles, we're still kind of working with it with the same system.
And there's probably a component of self-reinforcement there. So you have control over yourself because you can beat yourself up anytime you want, for example. And then that can become so habitual that it becomes ruminative thinking where it's automatic. But I imagine that there are a number of different ways to look at how that is a self-perpetuating behavioral process. Yeah.
And addictive, as you pointed out, functions the same way.
Great question.
Again, thank you both. I was wondering if we could transfer this information you presented here to craving for a person, like in codependence, or an addictive behavior in relation to a person. Okay.
Yep. Great question. So I think the beauty of this simple reinforcement loop, and it's important to really remind ourselves that this is an evolutionarily conserved process. So this is a fundamental learning process for our brains. So this can be applied to anything in which there is a reinforcement learning set. So whether it's, you can imagine all these different types of things, eating, getting the most likes on Facebook, all sorts of things, including codependence. So if we're addicted to having someone take care of us or to whatever that externally dependent relationship is, absolutely it fits the same way. And you could map it out. You can say, okay, if this person does this, I feel better, and therefore I'm going to try to get them to do this more, whatever this behavior is. So all of these external things that we depend on to keep that loop going. And you can see how that's really different than mindfulness because we tap into our internal okayness. And so there's nothing external that's needed. And so we can literally step out of the process. Yeah, good question. Hey Philip.
Thanks to you both. You mentioned in the neuroscience component the activity, the engagement of the prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate. Is there anything more to say about their interaction beyond if the posterior cingulate isn't activated, the executive function, which as a layman, I know the prefrontal cortex to be engaged? Is there anything more to say about the relationship, or it's just that it would free up the executive function by not activating the posterior cingulate?
So the posterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex are tightly coupled, as those two main hubs of the default mode. And there's been some good work done by Georg Northoff's group where they've really teased apart, what these two brain regions might be doing. It seems, at least their hypothesis is that the medial prefrontal cortex is kind of the seat of the conceptual self. And so the kind of I am, and whereas, again, at least our working hypothesis is that the posterior cingulate is that getting caught up in the I am. And you can imagine those two, they cohabitate the same space quite a bit, which is probably why they're very tightly coupled. There was a group in Florida that published a paper showing that when you bring in monitoring regions of the brain, such as the dorsal anterior cingulate, when those in a causal fashion, so they did Granger causality for those of you neuromergers out there, and they found that when the dorsal anterior cingulate was kind of damping down on the posterior cingulate, you got an improvement in performance in cognitive tasks. So it does, you could imagine that extrapolating to freeing up executive function to do what it needs to do. Yeah, so I think there are some indirect data that would suggest that that's actually what's happening. Yeah.
I just want to point out if anyone needs to go, or officially over our time, but this room is free for a while longer, and we're more than happy to stay and answer questions. So.
Thank you for that. I'm a psychologist in private practice, and I'm always trying to look beyond the DSM for sources of suffering, right? And I'm finding anecdotally more and more, for lack of a better diagnosis, an addiction to technology that's stubborn, right? There's an intermittent reinforcement schedule there of constantly checking the phone and looking for that hit of connection that's empty. And I'm finding it more and more with my clients. And I would love it is anybody doing research on this idea of technology addiction and potentially using mindfulness to help break that cycle? Because I can see how it would map well, but I hesitate to do a lot with it without evidence.
Right. There's certainly work, people love to study Facebook, and so there's some neuroimaging work showing that when you do self-disclosure types of things, which is what a lot of Facebook is about, it activates the nucleus accumbens, which is the same reward brain center that gets activated by crack cocaine, and you can actually predict how much someone's going to use Facebook based on how much their nucleus accumbens gets activated. So there's some direct evidence there, and I imagine that people are doing studies with the addiction to technology as well. I don't know of any that are published yet, but I'm sure that's out there. But as you pointed out, if you think of just your phone, you can anytime you are restless at all, you can pull your phone out and distract yourself with whatever ways you want to do this. You can get texts that intermittently come up, and you can get emails that intermittently come up, and it's a great way to get addicted to your phone. And I see Yale students walking across the street, like they forgot to look both ways. This fundamental thing that I have to drive carefully in New Haven because I'm going to run over Yale students. So it's certainly, I've seen it, and there's a study that showed that playground accidents are on the rise because parents aren't paying attention to their kids anymore. So I don't know what evidence you need, but the studies I'm sure will be coming out as well, and maybe Sarah knows more.
I don't know of any intervention studies. But as you're talking and I'm sort of reflecting on this, it seems so interesting to me because it's such a seemingly benign thing to grab for. So it's not like you're going to hit bottom and go to treatment. It's it's right there. It's it's pretty innocuous, and but to actually pause in that moment and think about okay, what is it I'm really wanting here? What is it I'm really hungry for? Am I bored? Do I need some attention? What is it? Just that little pause I think would be really interesting to work with clinically. Yeah, so go for it. Bring us some clinical data. I think it's great.
Great.
Hi, I'm glad we have extra time because I actually have 2 questions. And thanks for your presentations. So the first question I have, I might have missed this in your presentation. Now, both of you talked about it a little bit, but the mindfulness interventions that you were discussing, did you ever notice over time that the distance between their need to use this intervention, did it widen over time? Were there any changes in their need to, like, the craving cycle? Did it, with the relapse, people that had chronic relapsers, which are very difficult to treat, did you notice that there was an increase in the time between they felt cravings, like while they stayed sober over time? Or like for how long did you look at the?
I know that craving overall, in the recent study we did where we had a 12-month follow-up and we asked them about craving and substance use,
right.
And we did see decreases in craving over time. The times between craving, that's interesting, I don't know. We looked at the time until the first lapse, and did find that was significantly longer in the mindfulness groups than in the other 2 groups. So there just seemed to be a delay. One thing I would love to look at that we haven't looked at yet is, I think speaks better to your question, which is not necessarily when did someone first experience that, but are those happening further and further apart?
And fewer and far between as
Sure.
time goes, because you would think the patterning would start to reestablish itself in a more healthy way. Because you're breaking that cycle and you're sending the path down that different alley, you know?
Yeah.
So I would imagine after time, you would start automating that process, and you won't be conscious that I'm doing my mindfulness intervention. And the goal would be absolutely to create this new pattern, right, of process.
Right, and that's explicitly what we aim for, is to say, look, let's train this as your new habit.
Right,
I think
right.
that's what the sober breathing space is for, that's what RAIN is for. These informal practices are really critical
Yeah.
as new behavior forming units, if you want
Right,
to
so
think
it'd
of
be
it that
cool
way.
to see like how many people could say, well, today I consciously used it, or, you know, and then how long spaces, how they grow over time, and if eventually you do see changes where they don't have these acute, like every day I'd have to use this practice.
Yeah.
The other quick question I had was how you're defining sobriety. I mean, I know in addiction research and medicine, there's not a very good lexicon yet. Like, we can't define it's like good sobriety, bad sobriety, you know, they've been successful at 6 months or 1 year. I mean, there's people who are 26 years sober at 6 months. So I'm wondering how you define like lengths of time as being a success. You know, they didn't relapse. When do you know you've gotten them out of the cycle of relapse? Is there a point where that's?
Yeah. I think we look at that from a very more fluid harm reduction kind of perspective, where it's not a black and white. You know, I think that model is problematic in a lot of ways. You're either drunk or you're sober, because then you have one drink, you're drunk, keep going. You know, there's that kind of thinking is so rigid. So we looked at several different things. We looked at when people did relapse, how much were they using as one indicator? So the severity of the relapse.
How long they stayed in it, like over.
Yes, the period of time you stayed in it, and how soon after treatment you relapsed. So we tried to really look at all the different kind of perspectives on substance use.
Yeah, because you were talking about like food, where it's like there's a lot more recidivism. Like, you're gonna have little slips more with food than you would with something that you can, like, you don't have to have alcohol to survive. So there's gonna be a difference. But I would imagine, I was just interested how you define that. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
How does this work in children, obese children?
I'm sorry, can you
Obese children, obesity in children?
obese children?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the question? If there's
Right.
literature, research on that
or as
with
far
this
as-
program? Not that I haven't seen studies looking specifically. There's certainly some work
Yeah, Gene
on.
Christeller's done that
Yes,
for the
right here,
adults.
Gene Christeller on mindful eating and working with this kind of model with people who are challenged with binge eating disorder and other issues. But with children, Gene, do you know? Oh, that's great. I didn't know that.
Great, thank you. Yes?
Hello, thank you guys. I have a question. What do you do if the thing that you're trying to not be addicted to is something that's ultimately positive? You're just doing it too much. Like, you're using it to distract yourself from other things, like other activities you have to do, something maybe you love to do, but it's the only reason it's bad. Like, so you don't want to break the positive reinforcement cycle because you like to do it and it's a positive thing, but you're just doing it instead of like your homework or something, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, so what's positive about doing it instead of homework?
So, for example, like, it's a positive activity, like maybe like working out or something that is like a positive thing, but you just use it to, or like if you're an artist, you really love doing your art, but you're doing that at the extent of like not organizing your life or not doing anything else. You know what I mean? You're just like doing this one thing so much, and it's a positive thing for you. It's like not a like smoking or something, but you're just, the only bad part is that you're not doing something else.
Right. So that's where the awareness comes in, where you can see what the results are of whatever you're doing. So for example, if you're exercising, there are plenty of people that get addicted to exercise.
Yeah.
And they meet DSM criteria for addiction because they are, their jobs are suffering, their family life is suffering, and all of these things are suffering. So I think we have to be careful about saying, exercise is socially acceptable and it's a good thing to be in shape. But when you do anything to an excess, it can be detrimental, and it's important to look at all of the effects, not just, oh, I'm getting in better shape, but how is this actually affecting the whole picture? And this is where seeing clearly comes in. And also it's where, Buddhism is described as this middle way. So it's not taking any extreme, but it's seeing what is skillful and what is unskillful. And when you can see clearly, then you stop doing the unskillful things and you do enough of the skillful things such that they don't become unskillful by doing too much of them.
Cool. Thanks.
Right. Now, kindness, I'm not sure how much is too much there, but things like exercise and...
I was talking about juggling for myself.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I really appreciate that. I'm wondering if you controlled for people in your groups who were involved in AA meetings or group meetings and how that may factor in. I just know anecdotally that people say that one of the reasons they fall off the wagon is they stop going to meetings, and that's a whole other issue, I know, but just wondering how, if you you noted that in your research.
Yeah, we did. We measured that. And the studies that we did were actually in a treatment center that was very 12-step based, so it's a really interesting kind of relationship there. And what we learned was that it actually can go together beautifully and really complement AA. So we encourage people to continue to go to their groups. We co-varied that out in our analyses. And we didn't look at whether or not participation in the group affected their attendance in AA. That's actually a really interesting question to look at. Yeah. They did better in terms of not relapsing in the mindfulness group, but I don't know what their attendance in AA was like. That's a good question. What I really appreciated was that it was both a complement to AA and for people who were involved, and also an alternative for people who didn't really align with the AA model. So I think it can be both.
Thank you. So maybe we'll take these last three questions, and then if folks have questions, they can just come up afterwards.
So when you talk about mindfulness as sort of being a wedge between the craving,
Step closer.
when you talk about mindfulness as being a wedge between the craving and the behavior, and sort of breaking that link in the chain, it kind of reminds me of the behaviorist phenomenon of extinction, whereby you present a certain cue or stimulus multiple times, and you don't present the associated thing, and then eventually the associated response will sort of break. So I'm wondering to what extent you think the mechanisms of extinction might be overlapping with mechanisms of how mindfulness can prevent or change the link between craving and behavior.
And let me make sure I understand.
I heard little bits of it. I'm having a little hard time
So
understanding.
let me make sure I understand. So you're looking back at the behaviorism literature and seeing how there might be links between the behaviorist extinction and the mindfulness models. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I just wondering to what extent you think the mechanisms, there might be overlap in the sort of like the psychological or neurobiological mechanisms of those two.
Yeah, I actually think they're the same. I think mindfulness fits in with these behaviorist models very, very well. I'm not sure that either of us are proposing anything differently than what the behaviorists have proposed previously, and their data are beautiful. I think their data are
Britta
very nice.
Hotzel has a really nice paper that addresses that.
Sorry, can you say the name of it?
Britta Hotzel.
Holtzwell, okay.
Holzel.
And just a quick follow-up to that. So in behavioral extinction, it's not the case that you're sort of at ground zero if the sort of associations are sort of start to show up again in the environment, then the addictive or conditioned response can sort of like pop right back in. So I'm wondering, is it similar in mindfulness, or is there a difference in the extent to which it's robust against sort of recurrence of these associations?
Is it different in the recurrence of the associations, or is it similar to the extinction? Is that the question?
So just in extinction, you are still sort of vulnerable to those prior associations, like coming back again really quickly. And I'm wondering if mindfulness as an intervention differs in the sense of being more robust against those sorts of recurrences of those associations.
I would say that the loops are probably still there, right? Just like with extinction, that we're still susceptible. And the idea is that the stronger mindfulness is, as soon as those get triggered, mindfulness is there to help, not feed them.
Well, I think what we have over the rats in this situation is that we have the ability to look at that behavior and to see how it's affecting us in our lives and to have some insight into what's happening. So it's not just the conditioning that's going on. We have a little bit of say in it as well. We can kind of come in and say, oh, I see actually what's happening here. And I can kind of see through it and make a different choice anyway. That's a great question. Thank you.
And our final question of the afternoon.
Hey. I'm thinking about this in terms of other anatomical and physiological changes that are happening.
Can you step a tiny bit closer? I'm happy.
Sure.
Thanks.
Other anatomical changes that are associated with addictions and depressions, such as decreased hippocampus and D2 downregulation. And I'm wondering about this mechanism in relation to the timeline of recovery of those functions as a way to sort of sidestep those debilitations, right? Mental, functional debilitations, and also a separate question. How old is the link between the PCC and the medial prefrontal cortex? And I'm thinking of that in terms of animal models and what it's like for a rat to be caught up on it. And if you can sever that connection, I mean, if they do get caught up, pharmacologically or with optogenetics or in some other way to pursue this a little deeper.
We can start with the second question, which is, I have no idea how old that is. Good question. I have no idea. Yeah. So.
It's old.
There you go. Longer than a decade. Yeah. And the first question, just.
The first question was just with regards to other anatomical changes that are associated with addictions and depressions, like increased amygdala and decreased hippocampus, and the recovery timeline for that in relation to a 4-week mindfulness-based intervention.
Go.
Well, I can't speak in terms of the neurobiology. In terms of the sort of the clinical perspective on that, it's really difficult to work with people who are really early in their abstinence, I've found. There are just a lot of things that aren't settled yet, and the body's still going through so much, and to ask someone in that state to sit and observe I think is just not always maybe what's needed at that point. Maybe there's some more settling, and once the dust kind of settles and the body's kind of coming back into some kind of homeostasis, then, okay, what's next? How do we move forward? In terms of neurobiology.
Yeah, with the neurobiology, I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not even going to, I can think of a couple of studies where they've shown you can see differences in white matter tracts in hours after getting an SSRI, for example. So there can be really rapid changes that happen anatomically. And I know with smoking in particular, the downregulation of the nicotinic receptors can happen over the course of a month-long period. So those are just anecdotes that I think it's a very dynamic process where some pieces can happen quickly and some pieces take longer. But as far as the specifics, I'm not an expert there. Great question, though.
Great.
So thank you all.